for those folks as they do. So, Charles, thanks for your book, Body Broken.
Hey, you're welcome.
Tell me about this. Do you think that part of the issue that we face in this part of the 21st century in North American political, religious conversation is that people are going to churches with strangers in some sense, and they don't see the other person as a part of their necessary obligation in their own spiritual life. And they don't really foster a sense of empathy and of conversation to really get to know another person. Like, do you think there's something about what's happened in the development of churches where they're kind of religious dispensers, dispensers of religious services that people can come and participate in, but don't really have to know the other people around them? So if someone thinks differently on politics or on how money should be spent in the government or in their own budgets, it's like, well, that's kind of your problem and not really mine, because I'm working on my own spiritual life alongside you, but not face to face with you. Like, I
think that's a very interesting observation, and of course the answer would depend on the church. But I do think there's a consumer mentality that's very, very strong in American culture, and so church can become a show, which is all directed towards what's happening up front.
Right.
And there isn't this an appropriate sense of the obligations that we have to each other, and I think that's a tragedy. When I think about what the Bible tells us about the church, it tells us that in Ephesians 2 that Jesus Christ died to create out of a huge division in the first century between Jew and Gentile.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was about as profound a division as you can imagine.
Yeah, as deep as you get.
He died to create one new man out of that. I mean, it's a church should be sociologically inexplicable because of the power of the cross. And then, he not only died to make us one, but he prays. And if you read John 17, he prays that the church may be one the way he and the Father are one.
Yeah, there's like three chapters that are all this long prayer, and it's really leading right up to that, isn't it? Like,
it's quite amazing. And he says that, Father, I want them to be one so that the world may know you sent me. So in other words, it's strategically important for the mission of the church that people don't simply look forward toward what's happening up front, but they look across the aisle at each other to try to really understand each other and work it through so that they can have a genuine community generally. Because if they don't, what they prove to the watching world, and I think we must make no mistake, the world is watching because the world wants to marginalize Christ. If the church divides over politics, what the church, quote-unquote, proves to the watching world is that Jesus' cross didn't take, and that Jesus doesn't know how to pray.
It's interesting.
And that's pretty serious. So we really have to work on this. And I've got some ideas in the book about sort of how to work on how do we reduce the heat. I can share some of those with you if you like.
Yeah, because it seems to me, and I think Victoria has a comment for you as well, and it seems to me that churches that have figured out how to deal with this political issue well, that the disruptions around political difference wasn't what they were trying to solve, right? They were really trying to solve how do we live lives interconnected with one another where we participate in one another's redemption. And that then changes the whole format of everything you do. So it does seem like the solution is not just how do we talk about politics, but the solution is, and I think you bring this up in your book, the solution is how do we live with one another? And then these other issues can become a barometer for, to measure the temperature, but not so much the thermostat, right? It's not creating the tension. It's really highlighting the fact that, because if people won't talk to each other about their politics, they're probably going to have a really hard time talking to each other about the other deep things of their lives, right? Like,
so that's what I'm hoping to hear about is some of these different approaches that you discuss in your book about practical ways to help us all move forward into conversations with people that have different views, or to be in community with one another, even though we may ideologically have a lot of disagreement.
Yeah, well, it's true. Let me just share some of them with you. I think there's some. I've found a number. I've got both Republicans and Democrats in my church, and I found some distinctions to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And I share these with my people. One of them is a little bit abstract, but I think it's very important. It's between theocracy and influence. Theocracy identifies a particular group with the kingdom of God. And theocracy, we need to understand, ended or at least dramatically changed when Jesus ascended to the right hand of the Father, where he now rules over all nations and calls for a level of obedience and allegiance that no government could ever extract from us, because it's from the heart. And I think Christians have to be careful they don't start thinking or behaving theocratically, because I think we've left that season in the history of redemption. Christian influence is the thing, however, that it really is important. We do have to have public influence. And what Christian influence, as opposed to theocracy, is more subtle, but it's important to try to get it clear. What the influencer in us seeks to do, as opposed to the theocrat in us, is it seeks patiently to nudge the culture in the right direction by persuasion. So the theocrat in us wants to win and is driven by results, and that makes us angry because we don't really get the results we want. The influencer in us seeks to serve and is driven by faithfulness. So the influencer follows the pattern of incarnation. Jesus came down from the outside. He came into the world as its friend. So we get involved in the world as its friends, various political parties, action groups, so on. We come in as friends, but like Jesus, we take our orders from the outside, which means that we may have quote-unquote success in certain ways, which is great, but we may not have success, and we'll never quite fit in anywhere. But it's okay, because we're not in charge of results. We're in charge of faithfulness. Now, if Christians can understand that, can say to one another, look, we're in charge of faithfulness. We're not in charge of results. Then I think that will help them to relax a bit if the results don't come, or if the precise results they're looking for are not the same. So that's one distinction. Now, the second distinction is actually more practical and is really helpful. And that's the distinction between moral principle and political strategy. I think the church has an obligation not to fudge on high moral principle. Me as a preacher from the pulpit, I need to stand up, and I need to preach and call my people to the Ten Commandments. I need to call them again. I need to speak out against killing. I need to speak out against stealing. I need to speak out against bearing false witness and adultery and all that sort of stuff. And the Christians together, unabashedly, must, if they're faithful to the Scriptures and to Christ, they will affirm those things, and they will be glad to articulate them. But political strategy is a different thing.
Yeah.
A political strategy is a fallible human effort to nudge the culture into greater conformity to the high moral principles. And the minute you move from high moral principle to political strategy, the church has another obligation, which is to protect the consciences of its people, not simply from the outside world, but from each other, so that nobody ends up feeling like a second-class citizen because of strategy. So take abortion. I think the church has an obligation to speak out against abortion, but I think the church must not then go on to say, and therefore this is how you must vote, because voting is a very imperfect strategy. Now, it might seem like a no-brainer. If you're pro-life, you should vote pro-life. But I know there are plenty of pro-life Democrats who say, look, I don't think the likelihood is that we're going to ever be able to overturn Roe versus Wade. So I want to reduce abortions. My strategy is to reduce abortions by voting for the sort of people who will set up social networks which will help to reduce the need for abortion for those people who are in particularly difficult situations. Now, regardless of what one thinks about that strategy as opposed to the other one, and I think Christians ought to be able to roll up their sleeves and argue over which strategy is better, the church from the pulpit needs to be careful not to make either of those groups of people feel like they're second-class citizens because their strategy is different.
So how do you encourage people, like in your church? You're the senior minister of Emmanuel Presbyterian Church near Columbia University in Harlem, right? Are you in Harlem?
I'm actually right next to Columbia University. It's near Harlem.
Near Harlem.
But it's right next to a university.
I only bring that up because my son lives there. So
cool.
He lives in Harlem, just on the other side of Columbia. So at Emmanuel Presbyterian Church, like, how do you help people separate what are these necessary mandates from these political processes, right? Because what you hear amongst, let's say, the more conservative side of the Republican Party currently is that somehow taxation policy is a moral issue, right? Or in the 1850s and 60s, there was a big debate about slavery as being a moral issue or not. So I think people would agree with you. Yes, we should separate out the tactics from the inarguable, commitments of our conscience. But how do you help someone decide which category something should fall in, be it abortion or taxation policy or this kind of thing? Like, how is one nudged to?
Are you asking how do you define what the high moral principles are?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's not always easy, but I think a great place to start is with 10 Commandments. And I think that that I would try to make the case from the pulpit that there are certain non-negotiable moral principles. And but then what I would do, we have forums in our church. We're going to have another one coming up before this election where we talk about this distinction, and then we talk about it in principle, moral principle, political strategy. But then we have dialogue with each other. I think dialogue is very important. We need to kind of model how to have people who are going to vote differently talk about why the moral principles are the same, but the strategy is different.
Yeah, see, because I've found people have left the church that I'm the pastor of because I don't put in a category of high moral standard the items that they want to have in that category. So they just leave, right? Like they don't stay around, and I get that. Like I understand that, like, if it were something that I had in the category of high moral standard, and I was going to a church with some knucklehead that was like, actually, I think that one's quite negotiable, that might be a really hard thing for me. So let me just push you a little bit. Doesn't having these two categories, isn't that the heart of the problem? Is that there's these two categories of like inarguable high moral standards and then the dispensable tactics or or just kind of the less important topics? Isn't that what's created this problem? Is that Republicans and Democrats or independents or socialist parties, whatever, they just have different lists, and they actually are called their platforms, and they define them specifically, and then you just go to a church where they have on their high moral standard list the same things that you have on yours, or at least a close enough variation. Like, doesn't that just perpetuate the same problem?
Well, it can, and I don't have an easy solution to it, but I think you need to try to create non-pressurized, non-politicized venues.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Where you actually sit down and try to sort through what is a strategy and what is a policy. So, I mean, all the way from just one-on-one to small group discussions. And so you need to create in the church itself an atmosphere of trust where there isn't an immediate political decision that's pressing. You've got to de-escalate the venue. Because you're not going to make any progress on this if you're not talking to each other. You just have to do that. So that's what we try to do in our church. We try to have to de-escalate the venue. And like, for example, in another couple of weeks, we're going to have a Republican and Democrat talk about how they're going to vote, and then talk about why they're going to vote the way they vote, and then they're going to. And this is at a church-wide meeting, and then we're going to invite them to interact with each other, and we're going to invite the congregation to ask them questions.
That's great.
It is a slightly politicized venue because the election's coming up. But one of the things we're doing is that none of the elders and none of the pastors are going to be those two people.
Oh, great.
In other words, first of all, we're removing power from the discussion because we want our people to talk as peers on the issue. So I think, and another thing that I think will help de-escalate matters is to remind the congregation that public life is a broader thing than power politics.
Nice.
I think one of the reasons we get mad is that power politics is a very frustrating and very limited venue. You can only vote one way, and if you happen to succeed, well, wait 2 years.
Right.
And
right.
And what you just won and you lose, and so very few people, Christian or non-Christian, find themselves in positions of high political power. But every single Christian is a public Christian, and there are all sorts. And just that articulating that with your people helps them to realize that there are things they can do that they're not going to be terribly frustrated in because they're not up against the limits of power politics. So they can be involved. Well, prayer, for example. I mean, we don't want to. Prayer is an incredibly it's accessible thing. Anybody can pray about the country, and we sometimes don't really believe it's as powerful a means as God says it is. Or the arts, one-on-one conversations, journalism, living out a good public example in your public life, like keeping your promises and paying your bills and resisting bankruptcy just because it's easy. I think there's lots of ways that Christians can be challenged to make public righteousness attractive. On the abortion issue, for example, you could take an unwed mother in. You can help establish a crisis pregnancy center. Nobody that I know of on either side of the aisle is going to be against a crisis pregnancy center.
Right, you wouldn't think so.
Yeah. So it's de-escalate by moving public life into a broader venue.
Well, that's great. Charles, thank you so much. That's Charles Drew. He's the author of the book, Body Broken. Can Republicans and Democrats sit in the same pew? Or as it says on the back, can Christians be political activists without hating each other? So if that's an interesting conversation, you should pick up the book. It's worth the read and worth the conversation. Charles, thanks again for being on the show.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Good things to you. Bye-bye.